The US claims it's allocated more than $470 million for humanitarian aid to the Afghan people this year, including $144 million back in October. And various humanitarian organizations have been distributing vital goods to the country. But the Taliban says US sanctions dwarf the aid it's given and are crippling the country, preventing people from getting the supplies they need. Saskia Taylor reports.
The war might be over, but for Afghans, life is still a battle. As they stand by the roadside selling their possessions in exchange for a scrap of bread, they're probably asking, where are all the Western leaders who promised to stand by us?
We will remain at the side of Afghan women and men, doing our duty to protect those we can protect.
Working with the Taliban, of course, if necessary, will go on. And our commitment to Afghanistan is lasting.
There are very good reasons for continuing to stand by the people of Afghanistan after the withdrawal of the troops, at least in the context of development assistance.
We must do everything to avert the real risk that is out there of a major famine and a humanitarian disaster.
We will continue to support the Afghan people. We will lead with our diplomacy, our international influence, and our humanitarian aid.
Well, all those leaders, embarrassed still by their failure to impose democracy on others by force, turned to another favourite tactic: economic suffocation. That's right, they've shut the aid bank. A lot of foreign assistance has been halted, but that's not all. When Washington and its NATO allies fled, they took all Afghanistan's cash. The US has frozen $9.5 billion worth of assets belonging to the Afghan central bank. So even those lucky few who do have savings can't take anything out because Washington says so. Little wonder the Taliban's asking Congress to give it all back.
The freezing of assets and economic sanctions can harm health, education and other civil services from which the general public benefit. Damage to these building blocks will serve as the worst memory ingrained in Afghans at the hands of America.
But following a 2 decades-long pattern of placing little value on Afghan life, the US is not backing down now.
US officials made clear to the Taliban for years that if they pursued a military takeover rather than a negotiated settlement with fellow Afghans, then critical non-humanitarian aid provided by the international community in an economy enormously dependent on aid, including for basic services, would all but cease. That is what occurred.
So Washington wants to see reform before handing over any aid. That's fine. A lot of people would agree, but they're ignoring one ugly truth.
It's not going to affect the government. What it does is affect the people, always. And so that's the case in Syria, and that's the case in so many different other countries as well. So the people suffer for the policy of international sanctions, not government. For the West, they sell this to their own population. The U.S. will sell it to its own constituents and so forth. As this is a better option than going to war, we're going to put maximum pressure on. We're going to put sanctions on. It's seen almost like the moral way of waging war, when in fact economic sanctions are is as devastating, if not more devastating, than military intervention, really, to the people in those countries.
And that's the point. It's not people on the FBI's most wanted list who'll get punished. It's the average man on the street, the one who's already spent 20 years looking down the barrel of an American gun and watched drone strike after drone strike blow apart his country. The Taliban officials the US refuses to recognize will get their monthly checks. But doctors are now working unpaid in hospitals with holes in their roofs. Operating theatres are shutting because there's no electricity. Teachers can't afford to travel to school. Keeping with tradition, Washington is punishing the very people who don't deserve it.
This is probably the worst possible approach, and it says to me that it's the only conclusion you can draw from this is that the U.S. is trying to strangle the country of Afghanistan in order to create some level of strife or instability that might provide the preconditions for perhaps either regime change, which would be ideal for Washington maybe, or a civil war, where the West or an international peacekeeping force would need to come in again to restore order and so forth. So we can see another cycle possibly beginning now through this current situation.
No man left behind. That's the proud slogan of the US Armed Forces. And yet here we are, not one, but tens of millions, left behind in hunger, in poverty, and in despair.